Chapter 1. Are you afraid, my son? Darian nervously flicked a strand of fine blonde hair out of his eyes. No, my lord Reptu, he lied. Merely confused. He looked around wonderingly at the sleek, stark whiteness of the room in which he found himself, and thought fondly of the finely polished marble and ornate brocades of his own home. The old man allowed himself a smile, almost avuncular in its kindness, and his misty grey eyes sparkled. That is to be expected, of course. The sea voyage to Kandassi is long, and the trip disorientating even to we of the Pangistri. He raised a hand as Darian protested. Though the people of Kirith regard us with awe, and rightly so, we are not so very different from you. You will learn that in your time here. A door slid silently open, and Reptu took his hand and led him out of the room. The change from the antechamber's stark simplicity was staggering, and Darian grabbed Reptu's hand even more tightly as he struggled to maintain his balance. They stood on a narrow metal bridge, which, with no apparent means of support, spanned a vast abyss. From the ground, thousands of feet below, huge metal towers rose out of a misty blue glow and climbed up the opposite side 100 feet away. Pillars of multicoloured lights alternated with the towers, pulsing in time to the heartbeat drumming of unseen machinery. At intervals on the towers there appeared a stylised skull design, the macabre badge of the Pangistri. The air was tangy with some heady incense, and through the skylights in the huge domed ceiling, Darian could see the stars in the night sky. Behind the windows of the towers, Darian saw members of the Pangistri, the supreme guardians of Kirith. They were dressed in their customary habits and skullcaps, some scarlet like Reptu's, others of different colours which denoted their lesser rank. Each of them went about his or her silent and secret business, and paid no attention to the two newcomers. Curiosity was a mortal failing, and the Pangistri were far more than mere mortals. Kandassi, the wonder of the world, explained Reptu matter-of-factly, and added, It's better if you don't look down. Pulling Darian behind him, he marched off briskly over the bridge, seemingly unconcerned by the lack of any handrail along the structure. You lied earlier when you denied being afraid, said Reptu without any hint of reproach. But fear, like mediocrity, has no place here. As we cross this bridge over the abyss, so we walk the tightropes to our destiny. And our destiny is to recognise our highest potential and then surpass it. What have you done to surpass your potential, Darian? My lord, I don't understand, he said, fervently hoping that all the Pangistri didn't talk in such riddles. A note of impatience entered Reptu's voice, shattering his air of cold serenity. On Kandistri each of us has made his or her way from burrowing worm to the sentient beings we now are. We are chosen, special and unique, the seed of the lightning flash. Each of us has his own special talent. That is why we are chosen. Tell me what you have to offer the Brotherhood of Kandassi. I have some little skill with music, sir, Darian admitted, and kicked himself as he realised that Reptu would see through the false modesty as easily as he had seen through the earlier show of bravado. Darian had, in fact, been a child prodigy. At the age of 5, he was already master of the Corintol, the traditional wind and string instrument of the Kirithons, with its 470 keys and a sound which, it was said, could bring the stars back to the night sky. The next year he was performing his own compositions in public. It was said that one of his recitals had even moved the dark and saturnine Lord Procurator Huldar, leader of the Brethren, to tears. Now, at 16, he was one of the most respected and popular musicians in his town. His decision to join the famed Brotherhood of Kandassi to practice and refine his art had provoked muted protest from many quarters. But as Lord Huldar had pointed out, it was the greatest honour which could ever be accorded to a Kirithon. It was not an honour accepted hastily. When members of the Brethren first approached his parents 4 years ago, Darian refused. He had no wish to spend the next 10 years of his life with the old men and women on Kandassi Island, even for the sake of his music. The only decent conversation he'd get there would probably be from the sheep. His parents were also reluctant for their only son to leave home quite so soon. Only his older sister seemed keen on the idea. He would bring shame on the family if he refused. It was a tremendous honour, a marvellous opportunity to become the greatest musician and composer of the age. She only wished she had his talent. As Revna had about as much appreciation of music as a dead dung beetle, Durian suspected the real reason for her enthusiasm was to get him out of the way and become her parents' favoured child again. When his father died suddenly in a boating accident, things changed. The Lord Huldar himself, how that impressed the neighbours, came in person to offer his condolences and to spend more than an hour in private conversation with his mother. Shortly afterwards, his mother joined Revna in encouraging him to pursue his vocation. At the same time, audiences for his recitals were dwindling, causing him to doubt his abilities. Perhaps a sojourn on Kandassi might revive his flagging skills after all. Little by little his determination was whittled away. In the end, the only voice of dissent was that of his best friend, Raphael, and as his musical talents were even less than Revna's, Durian had never quite forgiven him for once falling noisily asleep during a concert, Durian decided that Raphael really didn't know what he was talking about. And so, after some initial instruction from Huldar, Durian had set out for the harbours of the Chosen, where he was met by Reptu and taken across the seas to the Skeet of Kandassi, the complex of buildings on Kandassi Island, which was the home of the Pangistri. "A musician," repeated Reptu as they reached the other end of the bridge and entered a waiting elevator. The doors, again decorated with the skull motif, closed automatically behind them, and they began their descent. "Tell me, Durian, did you ever hear of Karina?" The boy shook his head, and the irritating lock of hair flopped in his eyes again. He had never heard the name before. Then he frowned. Karina. Now that he came to think of it, the name did sound familiar. He tried to remember. "She was a dancer," said Reptu wistfully. "One of the greatest and most beautiful of her age. Her feet seemed never to touch the floor, and her elegance, her understanding and empathy with the music were joys to behold. Perhaps you will write music for her." "She's here?" Life on Kandassi was beginning to sound better. "Many have joined the Brotherhood," Reptu answered. "Artists like yourself. Scientists, prophets, men of great wisdom and women of terrible vision. All part of the great venture that is Kandassi." He turned to look at Durian and reached out a gnarled hand to stroke the fine down and smooth skin of the boy's round face. Durian flinched at the unwelcome attention. "And now you are to become part of that great venture, Durian," he said softly. "Bear that responsibility well, for much depends upon it." The lift came to a halt, and the doors opened onto a small corridor. At the end of the passageway, a pair of large, imposing doors opened outwards for them, as though they were expected. "I must leave you here while I arrange your quarters," said Reptu. "Make yourself comfortable, and I will return shortly." Reptu watched the boy walk through the doors, which closed softly behind him, and sadly shook his head. Such a pity that one had to lie, he thought, and especially to the young and beautiful. Durian entered a darkened room. The only illumination was the silvery blue glow of the moon, which shone through a narrow casement. He frowned as he wondered how the sky could be seen through the window when he had assumed that Reptu had taken him miles below the skeet. A shadow lurched from the half-darkness and approached him. "Welcome, young master," it hissed, and Durian instinctively backed away. The creature was bent almost double, but even standing upright it would only have been about 5 feet tall. Its snout constantly sniffed the air, and its 2 bulbous eyes darted this way and that. Sharp, pointed ears rose on either side of the weaselish face, and when the creature spoke it revealed yellowing teeth and sharp, vicious incisors. Apart from its face, the creature's entire body was covered with thick, matted brown hair. Durian cursed himself for his fear, knowing that the creature posed no threat to him. It was a companion, one of those who accompanied the Pangistri on their infrequent journeys away from Kandassi, acting as the ears and eyes of their almost blind and deaf masters. "Does fetch disturb you?" said another quieter voice from the shadows. Please don't be alarmed. He's not as handsome as your people, but he's a loyal friend and wishes you no harm." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Oh, please don't be concerned," said Fetch sulkily, and moved away from Darian to stand at the side of the other figure, who stood silhouetted in the moonlight. The voice was female, cracked and ancient, and at first Darian had to listen carefully to hear her. But despite its softness, the voice carried a power and authority which could not be ignored. Darian peered into the darkness as the woman walked stiffly out of the shadows towards him. The first thing he noticed about her were her eyes. Unlike the weakened eyes of the other Pangistri, hers were piercingly green and sharp. They followed his every move. An elaborate beaded headdress framed her finely boned face. It was a face which had been beautiful hundreds of years ago. Now, in the strange half-light, it looked hollow and empty. Darian was reminded uncomfortably of the animal skulls he and Raphael had once found in the moors and highlands outside their town. Almost 7 feet tall, the old woman bore herself regally and upright despite her age and the obvious discomfort she felt in walking. One bony 6-fingered hand grasped a long ebony staff, plain except for the small carved skull at its crown. Like the other Pangistri, she wore a long, high-coloured habit, but hers was of darkest blue and seemed to be made of a heavier and richer material. It was edged with decorative braid and glistened in the moonlight. Several slender chains of silver hung around her neck. She smiled at Darian, revealing surprisingly white teeth. "Welcome to Kandasi," she said, and nodded in welcome. "You are a musician. Please play for me." Darian looked puzzled, wondering who the woman was, until he saw a beautifully crafted corintol at the far end of the room. Fetch offered him a chair, and as Darian sat, the old woman came to his side, gently laying the long fingers of a bejewelled hand on his shoulder. A shiver ran through Darian's body, and he looked up at the woman's smiling face. "Now play. Play as you have never played before." Darian flexed his fingers and began to play. Perhaps inspired by the strange old woman, whatever doubts he had had about his skills left him, and his hands glided over the keys, coaxing and cajoling hidden sounds from the instrument. The old woman stood entranced. Her eyes were closed, and her head nodded gently in time with Darian's playing. All the time, Fetch looked at his mistress through narrowed, questioning eyes. With a resounding crescendo of horns and strings, Darian finished, leaned back in his chair, and sighed with self-congratulation. He hadn't played so well for a long time. He just hoped the old woman appreciated it. He looked up expectantly. For a moment she stood there, saying nothing. Then her eyes snapped open, and her mouth formed a wistful half-smile. A single tear trickled down her cheek. "I have not heard such music for many years. It is good that you have come to Kandasi, Darian. Now your music will fill our chambers and cloisters till the stars themselves return to the sky." A brief glance passed between the old woman and Fetch, who silently left the chamber. Before Darian had a chance to wonder how the old woman knew his name, she was talking excitedly to him about his music, animatedly pointing out the nuances in his playing, the elaborate structures in his composition, his dexterity at the keyboard. He was a true genius, she gushed. In 10 years' time he would surely be the greatest musician in all the 10 galaxies. Darian frowned, and was about to ask the old woman what a galaxy was, when Fetch returned. He brought with him a large crown encrusted with jewels, its filigree streaks of gold sparkling and beckoning in the moonlight. He passed it almost reverently to the old woman. "Be crowned our king of music, Darian." The old woman beamed and raised the crown over Darian's head. Darian winced. Praise was all very well, he thought, but this show of enthusiasm from a crazy old woman was becoming just a little too embarrassing. It was probably as well Raphael wasn't here. He couldn't stand ceremony at the best of times. By now he'd be howling with laughter. The crown was placed on his head, and a surge of well-being swept through him. In that instant his mind was opened up to all the possibilities before him, the symphonies he had in him to write, the instruments he could play, the beauty he would bring into the world. Dreamily he looked up at the passive, unsmiling face of the old woman. She was no longer the kindly gushing matron. Now she was a fierce, determined witch with greed and lust in her eyes, and he was afraid. He cried out in agony. White-hot pain seared through his body, and his brain felt ready to explode. He tried to raise his arms to remove the crown, but they stayed pinned to his sides. As his flesh peeled and fell smouldering away from his face and limbs to reveal bone, which instantly began to liquefy, one thought, one name ran through his mind. Not his beloved music, not Reptu, not Raphael, not Revna, but Karina. Karina, the name he had never heard before. Now he remembered. It was the name of his twin sister.